War doesn't just explode out of nowhere. It builds pressure. It sharpens knives in the dark. And by the time World War II erupted, the world was already trembling. This wasn't simply a fight between countries. It was a collision of ambitions, fears, ideologies, and raw survival instincts. On one side stood the Allied powers. On the other, the Axis powers. Together, they dragged the entire planet into the most destructive storm in human history. And once you understand who they were and what they wanted, World War II suddenly makes terrifying sense. World War II didn't start with a single gunshot. It started with resentment. After World War I, defeated nations were humiliated, punished, and economically strangled. The global economy collapsed. Democracies looked weak. Extremism looked decisive. This chaos created the perfect breeding ground for radical leaders who promised strength, order, and revenge. By the late 1930s, the world was splitting into camps. Not officially at first, but the lines were forming fast. Alliances hardened, military spending exploded, and everyone knew something catastrophic was coming. When the first invasions began, there was no turning back. The Axis powers were driven by expansion and dominance. At their core were Germany, Italy, and Japan. Each had its own reasons for war, but they shared one dangerous belief. The world needed to be reshaped, and force was the tool to do it. Germany under Adolf Hitler sought to overturn the post-World War I order. The goal was territorial expansion, racial domination, and absolute control over Europe. Hitler's regime fused nationalism with brutality, creating a war machine that moved with terrifying speed. Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, wanted to revive the glory of the ancient Roman Empire. It craved prestige and territory, especially in Africa and the Mediterranean. While Italy's military strength lagged behind its ambition, its alliance with Germany pulled it deeper into the conflict. Japan entered World War II driven by imperial hunger and, resource desperation. Isolated and starved of raw materials, Japan turned outward, aiming to dominate East Asia and the Pacific. Its military culture glorified sacrifice, discipline, and absolute loyalty to the state. Together, these nations formed the Axis. Not equal partners, but united by aggression. Their early victories shocked the world and made them seem unstoppable. The Allied powers didn't begin as a unified force. They were pulled together by necessity. Britain stood almost alone at first, refusing to surrender even as bombs rained from the sky. Its survival became a symbol of resistance. France fell quickly, but its fight didn't end. Resistance movements and overseas forces continued the struggle. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union entered the war after being invaded by Germany in 1941. This turned the conflict into a war of unimaginable scale. The Eastern Front became a slaughterhouse, consuming millions of soldiers and civilians. The United States joined later, but when it did, the balance shifted. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, American industrial power, manpower, and resources flooded into the war. Factories became weapons, oceans became highways of steel. The Allies were no longer just surviving. They were preparing to overwhelm. By the height of World War II, the Allied powers included dozens of nations across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Different cultures, different politics, one shared goal: stop the Axis at any cost. The Axis relied on speed and shock. Germany's early strategy focused on rapid invasions that shattered enemy defences before they could respond. This worked brilliantly at first. Entire countries collapsed in just a matter of weeks. But, speed has its limits. As the war dragged on, the Axis powers faced a brutal reality. They lacked the resources and industrial depth to sustain a global conflict. Long supply lines snapped, oil ran dry, and, factories just couldn't replace losses fast enough. The Allies adapted. They absorbed early defeats and learned. They coordinated massive operations across land, sea and air. Strategic bombing crippled Axis industry. Naval power strangled supply routes. And on the ground, overwhelming numbers slowly crushed resistance. World War II became a war of endurance. And in the end, endurance favoured the Allies. This wasn't just armies colliding, civilians paid the heaviest price. Entire cities were erased. Genocide became policy. The Axis powers, especially Nazi Germany, unleashed systematic murder on an industrial scale. Millions were killed not for strategy, but ideology. The Allies were not perfect. They made brutal decisions. Bombings killed civilians. Occupations brought suffering. But the core difference was purpose. One side fought to dominate and destroy. The other fought to stop that domination, even when the cost was horrific. By the end of World War II, over 60 million people were dead. Empires collapsed. Borders shifted. The world was permanently scarred. Understanding the Allied and Axis powers isn't just history trivia. It's a warning. World War II shows us just how fast economic pain, political anger, and of course propaganda can turn entire nations toward catastrophe. It also shows how alliances can save the world, but just how fragile peace really is. The scars of this global storm are still with us today. Modern conflicts, military alliances, nuclear deterrence, every bit of it traces back to lessons learned in World War II. If we ignore those lessons, history doesn't just repeat, it escalates. World War II was not inevitable. It was chosen step by step by leaders who believed power mattered more than humanity. The Axis powers gambled on domination. The Allied powers fought back with unity, sacrifice, and relentless resolve. And when the dust settled, the world was changed forever. If you want to understand how fragile peace truly is, you have to understand this clash. If this deep dive helped sharpen your perspective, make sure to subscribe to The Scars of a Global Storm Fronts. Share this video with someone who thinks history is boring. Because this story isn't just about the past. It's about the future we're still fighting to protect.